There's a truck stop called Hanley's, about 40 miles from my house in Bluefield County, West Virginia. It's the only place open all night between the Kentucky border and home, sitting right where Route 52 cuts through the mountains. Been making that drive for 15 years as a regional insurance adjuster, and Hanley's has been my regular stop more times than I can count. This happened back in October 2019, just before Halloween. I'd spent 3 days in Harlan County investigating a mining equipment claim, and I was bone tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after dealing with lawyers, accident scenes, and paperwork for 72 hours straight. All I wanted was to get home to Marlene and sleep in my own bed. It was past 1:30 in the morning when I pulled my F-150 into Hanley's parking lot. The place looked like something from another era. Flickering neon signs, cracked asphalt, and that particular kind of loneliness that hangs around truck stops at night. A few semis were parked in the back, their drivers catching sleep in their cabs, but otherwise the lot was empty. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that harsh, white glow. The night clerk, a kid with more tattoos than sense, barely looked up from his phone. I grabbed a coffee that had probably been sitting since dinner time, and one of those pre-made sandwiches that taste like cardboard but fill the hole in your stomach. That's when I noticed him. In the back corner, near the coolers where they keep the energy drinks, there was a man sitting cross-legged on the floor. Just sitting there, staring at the refrigerated cases like they held the secrets of the universe. At first, I figured maybe he'd had too much to drink and was waiting for someone to pick him up. Lord knows I'd seen stranger things during my years on the road. But something about his posture struck me as wrong. After 28 years adjusting claims, you develop an eye for things that don't add up. This fellow was wearing a heavy denim jacket, despite the warmth inside, and his shoulders were hunched in a way that suggested tension rather than relaxation. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging down to obscure his face. Professional habit kicked in. When you investigate accidents for a living, you learn to observe details that might matter later. I moved down the aisle, pretending to browse the snacks while keeping an eye on him. That's when I got my first clear look at his face. The man's eyes were impossibly wide, the whites showing all around the irises like a spooked horse. His lower lip trembled constantly, not from cold, but from something chemical coursing through his system. Methamphetamine, I'd guess, based on the telltale signs I'd learned to recognize from accident scenes involving impaired drivers. His skin had that grayish pallor that comes with long-term abuse, and when he turned to look at me, there was nothing behind those wide eyes. Nothing human. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. The man's head had snapped around with an unnaturally quick movement, like a bird of prey spotting movement. His expression was completely blank, not angry, not curious, just empty. It was the kind of look that makes your spine crawl, the kind that tells you on a primitive level that you're looking at a predator. I turned away and walked back to the counter, my appetite suddenly gone. The clerk rang up my coffee and sandwich without a word, and I paid quickly, eager to get back on the road. As I headed for the door, I couldn't resist glancing back toward the corner where the man had been sitting. He was gone. The parking lot felt different when I stepped outside. Quieter, somehow, with shadows that seemed deeper than they had before. I walked quickly to my truck, keys already in hand. As I started the engine, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Through the store's plate glass windows, I could see a figure moving rapidly toward the back exit. I pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto Route 52, heading north toward home. The road stretched ahead of me, 2 lanes of cracked asphalt winding through the dark mountains. This was coal country, where hollows ran deep between ridges, and cell phone service came and went like the wind. During the day, you might pass another vehicle every few minutes. At night, you could drive for 20 miles without seeing another soul. The radio crackled with distant conversations from truckers on the interstate, but otherwise the cab of my truck was silent, except for the hum of tires on pavement. I settled into the familiar rhythm of the drive, letting muscle memory guide me through curves I'd navigated hundreds of times before. That's when I saw the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. Another late-night traveler, probably someone heading home from a shift at one of the few remaining mines. But as the lights grew closer, something nagged at me. I was doing 65 in a 55 zone, not racing, but moving along at a good clip. Whoever was behind me was closing the distance fast. The headlights filled my mirrors, and I got my first good look at the vehicle. A pickup truck, older model, riding lower on one side like the suspension was shot. The kind of truck you see rusting in front yards all over Appalachia, held together with duct tape and prayer. The truck stayed right behind me for the next 5 miles, matching my speed exactly. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up, it kept pace. The headlights never wavered from my rear bumper, creating an uncomfortable pressure that made my shoulders tense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the driver was just following the only other vehicle on the road, using my taillights as a guide through the winding mountain passes. It made sense. These roads could be treacherous at night, especially for someone who didn't know them well. But deep down, some primal instinct was screaming that this wasn't about navigation. The truck suddenly accelerated and pulled into the left lane. I relaxed slightly, thinking he was finally going to pass. But instead of overtaking me, the driver matched my speed and stayed right alongside. I glanced over and felt my blood turn to ice water. It was the man from Hanley's. In the dim light from my dashboard, I could see his pale face turn toward me, those wide, unblinking eyes locked onto mine. His mouth was moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying over the road noise. His hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, and that constant lip tremor made him look like he was having some kind of seizure. He suddenly swerved toward me, and I jerked the wheel right, my tires hitting the rumble strips on the shoulder. The truck straightened and fell back behind me again. My heart was hammering against my ribs now, and my hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel. This wasn't road rage or some kind of driving game. This was something else entirely. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the F-150 up to 75. The truck behind me kept pace effortlessly. The headlights started flashing, high beams strobing in my mirrors like some demented lighthouse. Then came the horn, a long, aggressive blast that echoed off the mountainsides. 28 years of marriage had taught me when to fight and when to run. Marlene always said I had good instincts about people, that my job had given me a sixth sense about danger. Right now, every instinct I had was telling me to get as far away from this maniac as possible. I floored it. The truck's engine roared as I pushed it past 80, then 85. The speedometer needle climbed toward 90 as we crested a hill and started down a long, sweeping curve. Behind me, the other truck was still keeping up, but I thought I might be gaining some distance. That's when he rammed me. The impact came from behind and slightly to the left, sending my rear end sliding toward the guardrail. I fought the wheel, feeling the truck wanting to spin out on the narrow mountain road. Somehow, I managed to keep it straight, but now I knew with absolute certainty that this psychopath was trying to kill me. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the engine noise. He hit me again, harder this time. The sound of metal on metal shrieked through the night air, and I felt something in the rear bumper give way. My truck lurched forward from the impact, and I had to ease off the gas to keep from losing control completely. In that split second of deceleration, training kicked in. 20 years of investigating vehicle accidents had taught me about momentum, about physics, about what happened when two vehicles collided at high speeds on mountain roads. I knew that if I kept trying to outrun him, eventually one of us was going to end up in a ravine. So I did something he wasn't expecting. I stood on the brakes. The F-150 slowed violently, anti-lock brakes chattering against my foot. The truck behind me tried to adjust, but at that speed, physics took over. He shot past me like a rocket, his brake lights blazing red in the darkness. I watched as his truck started to fishtail. First left, then right, then left again, in ever-widening arcs. The vehicle completely lost traction and spun sideways across both lanes before sliding off the road. The last I saw of those headlights, they were tumbling down the mountainside, bouncing off trees and rocks like a pinball. Then silence. I sat there for a long moment, engine idling, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. The night air rushed in through my partially open window, carrying the smell of burning rubber and something else. Something metallic that might have been blood. I should have stopped, should have called for help. But all I could think about was getting home to Marlene, getting behind my own front door where the world made sense again. I drove the rest of the way home at exactly the speed limit, checking my mirrors every few seconds. When I finally pulled into my driveway at 3:15 in the morning, I sat in the truck for another 10 minutes before I felt steady enough to walk to the house. Marlene was asleep, but she stirred when I slipped into bed beside her. "How was Kentucky?" she murmured. "Just another claim," I whispered back, pulling her close. I never told her about what happened on Route 52 that night. Hell, I never even called the police. In coal country, sometimes it's better to let the mountains keep their secrets, but I still drive that road when work calls for it. And every time I pass the spot where that truck went over the side, I slow down and look. There's still a gap in the trees where something heavy crashed through. And sometimes, on nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the echo of that horn, calling out from somewhere deep in the hollow below. This happened back in the winter of 1996. I was 42, hauling agricultural equipment cross-country for Midwest Transport out of Des Moines. Been doing the long-haul runs for about 8 years by then, ever since I quit wrenching on combines and decided the road life suited me better than being stuck in some shop all day. The money was decent, and it let me provide for Colleen and our 2 kids back home. Little Danny was 7 then, and our girl Rebecca had just turned 5. I'd been on the road for 6 days straight, moving a shipment of John Deere parts from Illinois down to some farming operation outside Reno. It was one of those runs where everything that could go wrong did. First, I'd gotten delayed 2 days in Kansas City waiting on paperwork. Then I'd blown a tire outside Colorado Springs and had to wait half a day for road service. By the time I hit Nevada, I was running 3 days behind schedule and pushing hard to make up time. I was rolling westbound on Interstate 80, somewhere between Battle Mountain and Winnemucca, when the trouble started. It was past midnight on a Tuesday, February cold that cut right through your jacket. The highway was empty, except for the occasional eastbound trucker heading back towards Salt Lake. No cell towers out there back then, just endless dark desert and the hum of my Kenworth's engine. I'd been driving for about 11 hours straight, which wasn't unusual for those days. The CB was mostly quiet, except for the occasional trucker calling out smoky bears or road conditions ahead. I was listening to some late-night AM talk radio when I saw the broke-down rig on the shoulder about half a mile ahead. It was an older Peterbilt, maybe late 80s model, sitting dark with its 4 ways blinking. As I got closer, my headlights picked up a figure waving at me from beside the cab. Standard trucker courtesy says you stop and help if you can, especially out there where help could be hours away. I downshifted and pulled onto the shoulder about 50 yards behind the disabled truck. Through my side mirror, I could see it was a shorter guy, maybe in his 40s, wearing a heavy winter coat. He jogged up to my driver's side window as I cranked it down. "Much obliged for stopping, friend," he said, breathing vapor in the cold air. "Name's Quincy Drummond. Got myself a real problem here." He seemed normal enough. Talked like a trucker, knew the lingo. Said his alternator had gone out and his batteries were dead. Needed a jump or a ride to the next truck stop to call for road service. Back then, you couldn't just pull out a phone and call AOA. "Where are you headed?" I asked, though I was already reaching for my coat. "Just need to get to the Flying J in Winnemucca," he said. "Got a buddy there who can help me out. Won't take but 20 minutes. Something felt off about the whole situation, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Maybe it was how clean his coat looked, or how he kept glancing back toward his truck. But trucker code is trucker code. You don't leave a fellow driver stranded in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my jumper cables and followed him back to his rig. That's when I noticed the second set of footprints in the snow around his truck. Fresh ones, leading off into the darkness toward a concrete drainage culvert about 30 yards from the road. "You got a co-driver?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Quincy paused for just a second too long. "Nah, just me. Been solo for years." But I'd been doing this long enough to know when something wasn't right. The hair on the back of my neck was starting to stand up. I popped his hood and shined my flashlight on the engine. The alternator looked fine. More than fine. It looked brand new. "You know what?" I said, backing away from the truck. "Maybe I should just give you a ride to that truck stop instead. My cables are acting up anyway." That's when I heard the scrape of boots on gravel behind me. I spun around and saw another figure emerging from behind my trailer. Bigger guy, wearing dark clothes, carrying something long in his hands. In the dim light from my running lights, I could make out it was a tire iron. Quincy wasn't beside his truck anymore either. He'd moved to block my path back to my cab, and I could see something metallic glinting in his right hand. The desert wind picked up, howling through the drainage culvert, and for a moment it sounded almost like voices calling out from somewhere far below the road. Multiple voices, desperate ones. That's when I realized this wasn't just a robbery. This was something much worse. The bigger guy with the tire iron started moving toward me from behind my trailer. His name, I'd learn later, was Wendell Carver, though at that moment all I cared about was the fact that he stood between me and my cab, where I kept a .38 revolver in the door pocket. "Easy now, driver," Quincy said, his voice different now, colder. "Just need you to come take a look at something real quick." The wind kept howling up from that drainage culvert, and I swear I could hear something else mixed in with it. Not quite voices, but something that made my skin crawl, like whispers, or maybe crying. It was probably just the wind playing tricks, but out there in the middle of nowhere, your mind starts filling in the blanks with things you don't want to think about. I had two choices: make a run for my cab, or head toward that culvert where God knows what was waiting. Neither option looked good, but I'd been in tight spots before. 8 years on the road teaches you that sometimes the only way out is through. "Look, fellows," I said, raising my hand slightly. "I don't want any trouble. I got a wife and kids back home, and whatever you're thinking of doing here..." "Shut up," Wendell growled. He was close enough now that I could see his face in the glow of my running lights, scarred up, with dead eyes that reminded me of something I'd seen in a slaughterhouse once. "You're coming, with us, whether you like it or not." That's when I noticed the smell, sweet and rotten, like meat left too long in the summer heat. It was coming from the direction of that culvert, getting stronger as the wind shifted. My stomach turned, and I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was down there, I didn't want to see it. I feinted left toward Wendell, then spun and made a break for my cab. Quincy lunged for me, but I'd been loading freight for years and still had some strength in these old arms. I caught him with an elbow to the ribs that sent him stumbling backward. Wendell came after me fast, swinging that tire iron, but I managed to get my cab door open and dove inside. My hand found the .38 just as his first swing cracked the driver's side window. I rolled across the seat and came up with the gun pointed at his face. "Back off," I shouted. "Both of you back the hell off." Wendell froze, but Quincy was circling around to the passenger side. I could hear him trying the door handle. Thank God I always kept those doors locked. "You can't stay in there forever, driver," Quincy called out. "And we got all night." That's when I heard it clearly for the first time. Not the wind, not my imagination. Voices from that culvert. Multiple voices calling for help. Weak, desperate voices that sounded like they'd been calling for a very long time. I keyed my CB radio with my left hand, keeping the gun trained on Wendell with my right. "Breaker 19, this is eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 203 on I-80. Got an emergency situation here. Any unit, please respond." Static. Nothing but static. But then, through the radio speaker, I heard something that made my blood freeze. One of those voices from the culvert, coming through the CB clear as day. "Help us, please. He keeps us down here." Wendell started laughing. A sound like grinding metal that seemed to go on way too long for human lungs. I gunned the engine and popped the clutch. 30 years of driving kicked in, and that big Kenworth lurched forward. Wendell dove out of the way as I swung wide back onto the interstate. In my mirrors, I could see Quincy running after me, screaming something I couldn't make out over the engine noise. I didn't slow down until I hit the Flying J in Winnemucca, where I found a Nevada state trooper getting coffee. Took 3 hours to convince him to drive back out there with me, and by the time we arrived, both trucks were gone. No sign anyone had ever been there, except for those footprints in the snow leading to the culvert. The trooper wouldn't go down into that drainage pipe, said it was outside his jurisdiction. But I could still smell that sweet rot coming up from the darkness below, and those voices. I could still hear them, fainter now, but still calling. I never drove that stretch of I-80 again. Found other routes, even if they added days to my runs. Colleen never understood why I suddenly refused certain loads, but some things you just can't explain. To the people you love. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I still wonder about those voices. How long they'd been down there. How many other truckers had stopped to help Quincy and Wendell over the years. And I wonder if they're still calling out from that culvert, hoping someone brave enough to look will finally come along. This happened to me back in 2018. I was 52 at the time, had been driving commercial routes for over 25 years, hauling agricultural equipment across the northern plains for Westfield distribution. Most folks think long-haul driving is just about staying awake and making time. But after a quarter century behind the wheel, you develop instincts. You learn to read the road, the weather, and most importantly, other drivers. That night on Highway 2 through Montana, Those instincts saved my life. It was February 14th, Valentine's Day, ironically, and I was making a late run from Great Falls to Havre with a specialized grain elevator component. Eleanor had packed me roast beef sandwiches and reminded me to call when I reached the delivery point. "Drive safe, Cliff," she'd said, same as always. After 28 years of marriage, she's still worried about these night runs, especially in winter. I'd left Great Falls around 9:30 p.m., figuring I'd reach Havre by 1 a.m., drop the load at the agricultural depot, grab a few hours sleep at the truck stop, and be home for a late breakfast. The temperature was sitting at -15, and the highway stretched ahead like a frozen black ribbon under a moonless sky. Highway 2 through north central Montana isn't like the interstates. It's 2 lanes of asphalt cutting through endless wheat fields and ranch land, with maybe 20 miles between any signs of civilization. Cell towers are sparse. Ranch houses sit miles back from the road, and if your truck breaks down, you might wait hours before another vehicle passes. It's beautiful country in daylight, but at night in winter, it can feel like driving across the surface of a dead planet. By 11:45, I was about 40 miles east of Great Falls when fatigue started creeping in. I'd been up since 5 a.m. loading equipment, and my eyes were getting heavy. I spotted a rest area sign, one of those basic state facilities with a brick restroom building and a few picnic tables. Nothing fancy, but a chance to walk around, splash cold water on my face, and grab a coffee from my thermos. The rest area was completely empty except for one vehicle. A white cargo van parked at the far end of the lot, well away from the single security light. The van had no company markings, no rear windows, just dirty white panels and Montana plates I couldn't make out from that distance. Its lights were off, and I couldn't tell if anyone was inside. I parked my rig near the light and locked the cab before heading to the restroom. The building was typical state issue: cinder block walls, institutional lighting, and the smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else I couldn't identify. The heating system made a rhythmic banging noise that echoed off the concrete walls. When I pushed open the heavy door to the men's room, my breath made clouds in the frigid air. The place was barely heated. I went about my business quickly, then moved to the sink to splash water on my face. The fluorescent light overhead flickered intermittently, casting shifting shadows across the cracked mirror. As I dried my hands with rough paper towels, I heard something that made me pause. The distant sound of an engine starting. Through the small, frosted window, I could see headlight beams moving across the parking lot. The white van was backing up, turning around to face my truck. My instincts kicked in immediately. In 25 years of driving, I'd learned that when something feels wrong, it usually is. There was no good reason for that van to reposition itself while I was in the restroom. I quickly finished up and stepped back outside. The van was now idling about 50 feet from my truck, headlights pointed directly at my cab. I could see 2 silhouettes behind the windshield, but the headlight glare made it impossible to make out faces or details. The engine was running, but neither occupant got out or made any move to use the facilities. I kept my pace steady and casual as I walked back to my truck, but every nerve in my body was on alert. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the parking space and headed for the exit, I watched my mirrors carefully. The van didn't immediately follow. It sat there for maybe 30 seconds after I'd pulled back onto Highway 2. I began to think maybe I'd been paranoid. Perhaps they were just resting or waiting for me to leave before using the restrooms themselves. Then, about 2 miles down the road, I saw headlights in my side mirror, 2 bright points growing larger behind me. The van was coming, and it was coming fast. At first, I maintained my speed, hoping they'd pass and continue on their way. But as the headlights got closer, I could make out the boxy shape of the cargo van in my mirrors. It pulled up behind me and stayed there, matching my speed exactly. When I slowed down, it slowed down. When I sped up to 75, it kept pace. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. After a few more miles of this, the van suddenly pulled into the oncoming lane and accelerated alongside my truck. Through my side window, I could see the passenger gesturing frantically, pointing at my trailer and making hand signals I couldn't understand. The van stayed alongside me for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds. The passenger kept pointing at my trailer, his mouth moving like he was shouting something I couldn't hear over the engine noise. My first instinct was to check my mirrors. Maybe a strap had come loose, or the tarp was flapping. But I'd secured that load myself before leaving Great Falls, and I knew it was solid. That's when the real alarm bells started going off in my head. I was hauling a single piece of equipment, a grain elevator component that took up maybe a quarter of my trailer bed. There wasn't much to come loose, and certainly nothing that would be visible from the side of the truck. These guys weren't trying to help me. They were trying to get me to stop. I kept my eyes forward and my hands steady on the wheel, pretending not to notice them. The van's driver started edging closer to my lane, forcing me toward the shoulder. I could feel my heart rate climbing, but I'd been in tight situations before. The key was to stay calm and think ahead. After another minute of this intimidation, the van suddenly accelerated and pulled in front of me, cutting close enough that I had to tap my brakes. For a terrifying moment, I thought they were going to slam on their brakes and force a collision. Instead, they slowed down to match my speed again, now controlling the pace from the front. I backed off, putting some distance between us, and started planning my next move. The Highway 2 corridor through this part of Montana is mostly ranch land, but I knew there was a truck stop about 15 miles ahead at the junction with Highway 87. It was a 24-hour operation called Fairchild's Travel Plaza. Bright lights, security cameras, and usually a few drivers around even in the middle of the night. The van stayed ahead of me for the next 10 miles, sometimes slowing down until I had to reduce speed to avoid rear-ending them, sometimes speeding up and disappearing around curves only to reappear in the distance. They were playing games, keeping me on edge, and it was working. When I finally saw the truck stop's neon sign glowing in the distance, I felt a wave of relief. I signaled for the exit and pulled into the plaza, parking directly under the brightest light near the fuel pumps. Several big rigs were lined up for the night, and I could see activity inside the diner through the large windows. The white van didn't immediately follow me into the lot. I sat in my cab for a minute, engine running, watching the entrance. Just as I was starting to think they'd moved on, the van appeared at the top of the ramp, moving slowly into the truck stop like a predator stalking prey. I grabbed my cell phone and climbed down from the cab, heading straight for the diner. The bell above the door announced my arrival, and the woman behind the counter, a sturdy woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a ponytail, looked up from her paperwork. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep the tension out of my voice. "I've got a situation. There's a white van that's been following me for the last 20 miles, and they just pulled into your lot." Doris Pemberton, that's what her name tag read, took one look at my face and understood this wasn't a joke. She glanced toward the window, then called over to a trucker sitting at the counter. "Randy, you need to come here." Randolph Fairchild stood up from his coffee, a bear of a man in his mid-40s wearing a flannel shirt and work boots. When Doris explained the situation, his expression hardened. "Show me," he said simply. We walked outside together, and Randy immediately spotted the van idling at the far end of the lot, positioned so it had a clear view of my truck. "Yeah, that ain't right," he muttered. "Stay here." I watched Randy walk directly toward the van, his stride confident and purposeful. He stopped about 10 feet from the driver's side and said something I couldn't hear. The conversation was brief, maybe 15 seconds. Then the van suddenly reversed, swung around in a tight arc, and peeled out of the lot, heading back toward the highway. Randy returned, shaking his head. Two guys, both in hoodies, wouldn't make eye contact. As soon as I asked what they were doing, they took off. You did the right thing coming in here. I stayed at Fairchild's for nearly an hour, drinking coffee and talking with Randy and Doris. They'd both heard similar stories over the years, predators who targeted lone drivers on remote highways, using various tactics to get them to stop. Randy gave me his CB handle and told me to call out on Channel 19 if I saw them again. The rest of my drive to Havre was uneventful, but I kept checking my mirrors every few seconds. When I reached the agricultural depot and examined my truck, I found something that made my blood run cold. Fresh fingerprints on the rear door handles of my trailer, as if someone had tried to open them. I called Eleanor when I got to the truck stop in Havre, even though it was 2:30 a.m. "I'm okay," I told her, "but I won't be taking any more night runs through that stretch of highway." 6 months later, I transferred to day routes only. Some might call it overcautious, but after 25 years on the road, I've learned to trust my instincts, because I'm certain that if I had pulled over when those men signaled me to stop, Eleanor would never have gotten that phone call.